So why don't we normally just try a feeding tube whenever it's recommended? Hi, I'm Chelsea, the palliative PA, and if you're not already, follow along for my page if you're enjoying my videos, and definitely share this with someone who you think could benefit from this information. Why do we not just try a feeding tube if we think that it could be beneficial? So there's a few answers here, and I want to just dive into them just a little bit today. So first of all, when it comes to a feeding tube, there are very specific situations in which a feeding tube is recommended. And this is often whenever there is something going on that someone cannot eat by mouth anymore, which sounds obvious, I know, but listen, it's amazing the times that these come up and why they come up. So sometimes if someone is just not eating quite enough by mouth, this will come up. And really the first initial thing we should do is really try to get that person good, high calorie, high protein supplements and make sure that every bite, every sip that goes into their mouth is packed full of nutrition. Because if we can get nutrition in orally into the gut to work that way, that is the absolute best way to get nutrition in. If that way is not working for some reason, whether there is obstruction, whether someone had radiation and chemotherapy and their mouth is very sore or they're unable to swallow, sometimes those are reasons to talk about a temporary feeding tube just because we know this should get better. Those are situations where if somebody isn't opposed and their goal is cure and their goal is to get as good as possible, then they make sense. The times that they don't always make sense and why we shouldn't always try a feeding tube is whenever someone says very distinctly, I never want a feeding tube, or I don't think I would ever want a feeding tube, and we're not sure if we put a feeding tube in, if it could be a long-term situation. So for example, if we have someone who's very sick in the hospital and is not eating by mouth almost at all because of whatever reason, whether they have no appetite, they're very ill, this person ultimately could be dying, and we may just not know it yet. So if we put in a feeding tube, it may be long-term and it may actually prolong their dying process. And if they tell us they would never want a feeding tube, even if it means they could die, then by all means, let's follow their wishes. Now, the other times that come up is sometimes we're not sure and we think maybe this person is just not getting better because their nutritional status is so poor. So if we put a feeding tube in, even temporarily, even for a couple of days or a week, maybe we can improve their nutritional status enough to kind of get them back on their feet. So in this situation, usually if a patient is kind of on the fence about it, we can try putting a feeding tube in. And if the feeding tube is in and gets in, and why I say that is sometimes they don't go in easily and then the patient refuses it after we have a hard time getting it in because they're not comfortable. They're not easy to get in all the time. So anyway, I digress. So if we do get the feeding tube in and we're giving nutrition through the feeding tube for 3 days, 7 days, 10 days, and we're really not seeing the improvement that we hope to see, then it might be time to say, okay, we know we don't want a long-term feeding tube. Let's take the feeding tube out and just let nature take its course if that's the time that we're at.